So before I start talking about what I really want to talk about today, I must say that David and Carlos have just done a brilliant job at explaining all that stuff, which I don't understand, none of it. And David and I were having a conversation last night, and I mentioned how I struggle to use my phone on a daily basis, and I should be ashamed, but I'm not. So thank you so much, Carlos. I was joking when I said that I didn't understand it. I understood quite a bit of it, and I'm going to be very frightened in the coming days. AI, creating AI, don't even know what that means. So let's start. Good afternoon, everyone. So I guess something Carlos said earlier was about saving humanity. And I, for all intents and purposes, I'm going to talk about saving humanity as well. We're just going to come at it from two very, very different parts. What I would like to talk about today, of course, we are all gathered here, and isn't it just marvelous that we're in one of the most revered places, and my heart is moved, but my mind is so fixed on the problem that we have today, which is the prevailing trust deficit when it comes to humanity and what's going on around us on a daily basis. And are we completely oblivious to the fact, or are we so entrenched in it that we have almost become desensitized? So architecturally speaking, there is very little that is going to save us from the Eden's whale trap. What we currently observe around us is a sectional response to problems of global magnitude. And I can't imagine a global problem being solved by sectional responses or sectional solutions. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated to us the limits of international institutions across the globe, which includes WHO, which includes the UN, the inefficacy of them all to promote and regulate good global governance, to create and enable collective action to find global solutions to a global problem. It boggles the mind, it truly does. And these are institutions, global institutions, with subject matter expertise unparalleled. And if they can't solve these problems, or let alone solve them, at least create policy which can protect us in the future, then what exactly is it that we need to do today to address that? If they can't do it, we need a new global coalition. And when I say a new global coalition, I'm not talking about some almighty, thunderous regulator of nations. What I'm talking about is simply a global coalition that brings together collective intelligence, policy making, coordination, and facilitation of accountability at large. And perhaps certain ways, so that we're not just talking about all of this in a macro sense, would be to look at factors like global supply chains, and how it is undeniable that although we can't seem to find a way to work together, but we've created a globally integrated economic infrastructure, and technology is a very critical part of it, and the disruption of which has spared no one. And we've witnessed that in the past 2 years. And any remote disruption to the global supply chain, regardless of sector, is going to continue having devastating effects on not only from an economic perspective, but also on humanity. Of course, but one only realizes that when you spend hours and hours and hours reading about it, which is exactly what I've done in the past year and a half. So coming back, I'm going to take a couple of steps back and just break it down into two simple terms, or two simple ways to explain how we are being affected. We are being affected at the political level because there is, of course, a crisis of global governance, and the only way to resolve that is to create and enable, to create a platform and enable collective action. The second side of it, or the other side of it, which is even more critical, is the economic side, and that, of course, can be addressed by the restructuring of global supply chains. Now, how must we do that? So from my point of view, or in my personal opinion, one can restructure global supply chains by with the objective of creating a framework that creates an incentivized engagement rather than one of penalty and that is punitive, which seems to be the case, or it has been the case for the longest time. So that doesn't work. It's negative reinforcement, and we've seen that not work in our lifetimes. So the other option is that we create a framework that incentivizes engagement and promotes values that we all share and are shared by the nation states that want to collectively work together, that want to create, hedge and protect against the weaponization of interdependence. And once again, a very, very critical link with technology as well. So I don't know how familiar all of you are with the Quad, but they've done some exceptional work in the past few years, or are continuing to do some exceptional work. Of course, one very clear and present example was how multilaterally they were more effective in the vaccination program than anyone else in the world to begin with. Of course, the US administration, the Biden administration, was very supportive, but again, a sectional response. Quad on its own is a sectional response. It's made up of 4 nation states. We've got Australia, Japan, America, and India. But it's a model that can be replicated on a global platform. If we look at what they're doing now, it's a collaboration and a collective enablement of participating and engaging in critical technologies that are non-military. So therefore, there is a political correctness, if you want to call it that. But more certainly, it is a collective action amongst states and amongst nation states that share the same values and that are promoting their shared values. So coming back to our economic impacts, I think to frame economic incentives for nation states that can collectively work together, that can share values that are sustainable, that wean us off the interdependence, or as I said, the weaponization of interdependence, and of course, the democracy premium that will prevail if you are successful in creating such a framework. But moving forward from there, so we're talking about sectional responses, and we've talked about, or I have talked about, a global coalition and how it certainly does not need to be a regulator of nations. But what we do need, before we get into any more further sort of, let's say, lobbying of the right kind of influences or think tanks and policymakers around the world, is to realize and acknowledge that the internationalism that we have today is outmoded for the challenges we face. What we need is a more pragmatic internationalism. What we need is that the wisdom of experience that we've gained in the past 2 years and years before that should not be wasted. What we absolutely need is idealism backed with practicality, otherwise it's just wishful thinking. So when we talk about a new form of internationalism, we need to look at certain factors. And those certain factors, so we're coming up with the G20 summit is coming up, and it's going to be in Rome, and of course it's something I think the whole world is looking forward to. What happened at the G7 summit, and again I talk about internationalism because the great big plan that came out of the G7 summit was the global infrastructure plan. The global infrastructure plan, in theory and on paper, is absolutely brilliant, of course. There's going to be trillions and trillions of dollars that are going to be invested globally, and especially in markets that absolutely need it. Frontier markets, markets where there's significant geopolitical risk, markets where literally humanity is suffering, countries where a day in a life of a person from a socio-economic weaker section of society suffers. It's a challenge just to survive. The global infrastructure plan that is promoting $20+ trillion of global output on a year-on-year basis has not considered that there's going to be $6 trillion of it that's going to basically disappear due to corruption and bribery. Because the markets that they are proposing to create these big mammoth-like infrastructure, or be it social infrastructure, utility infrastructure, or just good old traditional infrastructure, are rife with corruption, are rife with embezzlement. And construction is one sector that is so large and so complicated that every step of it is going to impact the local community and maybe, just maybe, leave them worse off than before, than when our global leaders decided to create a global infrastructure plan. So the point that I've taken away from it, and the point that I would like to make today with regards to our collective thinking, of course this is the Global Leaders Conference, and I hope that when I stop speaking today that some of you might remotely agree with the fact that what we need is better and more sophisticated policy making, but apart from that, we need it to be practical. We need it to be very, very pragmatic. And for us to be able to do that, I think the creation of a coalition that has in its own house an International Investment Council that for all intents and purposes acts like the Blue Dot Network, which was created in Australia, which basically quality assures projects, be it of any sector, but of course infrastructure being the critical one of them. It makes sure there is a true and meaningful engagement with the local communities. There is actual value creation. There is upliftment of the society. There's community development. We are not leaving the people of these communities worse off after we come in there with our big machines and with our big infrastructure plans and our trillions and trillions of dollars, of which 6 trillion will actually get embezzled and will go towards corruption on a yearly basis. And also, for the various fund managers around the world who are sitting on $150+ trillion of infrastructure capital allocation will not be investing in these regions. So where exactly is the global infrastructure plan going to find all the trillions? Because they certainly can't afford it country by country. So again, coming back to the fact that there needs to be true and meaningful interaction with the local communities, it needs to have a quality assurance process. It needs to be done by a sophisticated platform, by way of sophisticated policy making, which is practical, pragmatic. It has attached, along with think tanks and policy making influences, and which are largely apolitical, of course, because that is the only way to make sure that things are done a certain way and they're unbiased. And I think in conclusion, all I would really like to say is that we should not live in a land that time has forgotten. And if I was to borrow from the words of Sir Winston Churchill, I think, isn't it time again for us to invoke the anthem of a better world? I certainly hope so. Thank you.